In the early hours of December 7, 1941, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm and almost perfectly still. The Hawaiian air was warm, a light breeze moved across the harbor. It was Sunday morning. On board the American battleships anchored along Ford Island, the day had begun like any other. Sailors were finishing breakfast, some were reading letters from home, others were preparing for church services. Few imagined they were standing at the edge of one of the most consequential moments in modern history. Tensions between the United States and Japan had been rising for years. Japan sought expansion across Asia and the Pacific. The United States had responded with economic sanctions and oil embargoes, measures that threatened Japan's military ambitions. Negotiations dragged on through 1941, but behind the scenes, Japan had already chosen a different path. The architect of that path was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto understood the risks of war with America. He had studied in the United States. He knew its industrial strength. He reportedly warned that Japan could dominate for a short time, but could not guarantee victory in a prolonged conflict. Still, he believed that if war was inevitable, it must begin with a decisive strike. The plan was bold and unprecedented. Japan would launch a surprise aerial attack across thousands of miles of open ocean. Its goal was simple: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one devastating blow. If America's battleships were destroyed, Japan would gain the freedom to expand across Southeast Asia without interference. Before dawn, a Japanese carrier task force moved into position north of Hawaii. More than 350 aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers were prepared for launch. Pilots received final briefings. Engines roared to life. One by one, the planes lifted into the gray morning sky. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The attack came without warning. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over the water, releasing their payloads toward the massive battleships anchored in a neat row. Dive bombers screamed down from above. Within moments, explosions shattered the quiet harbor. On Battleship Row, the USS Arizona was struck by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her deck and detonated in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. A towering fireball erupted, splitting the ship apart. In seconds, more than 1,100 men lost their lives. Thick black smoke poured into the sky, visible across the island. Nearby, the USS West Virginia absorbed multiple torpedo hits and began to sink. The USS California took on water rapidly. The USS Oklahoma rolled over after sustaining repeated strikes, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. The USS Nevada attempted to get underway, her crew determined to escape the harbor and avoid blocking the channel, but she too was hit and eventually forced to beach herself. The airfields were also under attack. At Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, American aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip, making them easy targets. Explosions tore through parked planes. Many were destroyed before their engines could even start. The Japanese had calculated that Sunday morning would mean reduced readiness, and they were correct. For nearly 2 hours, the harbor was a scene of chaos. Smoke, fire, and debris filled the air. Oil spread across the water and ignited in places, turning the surface of the harbor into sheets of flame. Communications were confused. Orders were shouted above the noise of gunfire and explosions. Yet amid the devastation, there was resistance. Sailors ran to anti-aircraft guns. Some fired with ammunition they had to unlock from storage. Others used whatever weapons were available. Medics established makeshift aid stations.
Crews fought fires and tried desperately to save their ships. Acts of courage unfolded everywhere. Men cut through steel to free trapped shipmates. Others carried the wounded through burning corridors. Many who had never faced combat before that morning responded with determination under unimaginable pressure. By approximately 10 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese aircraft withdrew, leaving behind destruction on a scale few had thought possible. 8 battleships had been damaged. 4 were sunk or capsized. Nearly 2,400 Americans were dead. Over 1,000 more were wounded. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed or severely damaged. From Japan's perspective, the mission appeared to be a stunning success. The core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Battleships, the dominant symbols of naval power, rested on the bottom of the harbor. Across Japan, early reports were met with celebration. The surprise had been complete. The blow had been devastating. But beneath the surface of what seemed like total victory, crucial details told a different story. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. They had been at sea. At the time, battleships were still considered the backbone of naval warfare, but aircraft carriers would soon prove far more decisive. Even more significant, the attack had not targeted critical infrastructure. The massive oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor remained intact. The submarine base was untouched. Most importantly, the repair facilities and dry docks were undamaged. These decisions would matter profoundly in the months ahead. The following day, December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation and Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. What had been a distant conflict became immediate and personal for millions of Americans. In the hours after the attack, Pearl Harbor looked like a graveyard of twisted metal. Ships lay on their sides. Smoke continued to rise for days. Divers entered dark, flooded compartments in search of survivors. Families across the country began receiving telegrams that delivered heartbreaking news. Japan believed it had neutralized the American Pacific Fleet for years. It believed that shock and loss would weaken American resolve. It believed the road across Southeast Asia was now open. But even as smoke drifted across the harbor, something else was happening. Engineers began assessing damage. Naval officers organized salvage operations. Divers prepared equipment. Plans were drafted not for abandonment, but for recovery. Pearl Harbor was wounded, but it was not destroyed. The attack that was meant to secure Japan's dominance instead awakened a sleeping industrial giant. American shipyards would soon operate around the clock. Factories would convert to wartime production. Millions would enlist. On that quiet Sunday morning, Japan sought to end American influence in the Pacific. Instead, it ensured America would fight with unprecedented determination. December 7, 1941, divided history into before and after. It was the day the world changed, and it was only the beginning.
When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared into the clouds above Oahu, commanders aboard the carrier task force allowed themselves a rare moment of satisfaction. The mission had unfolded almost exactly as planned. Surprise had been achieved. Battleships had burned. American air power on the island had been smashed before it could rise to meet them. Across the Pacific, as reports reached Tokyo, officials within the Imperial Japanese Navy described the operation as a decisive triumph. Newspapers prepared bold headlines. The narrative was clear. The United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. The road to expansion across Southeast Asia now lay open.
Yet beneath the celebrations, the reality was more complicated. The mastermind of the operation, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had never viewed the attack as a guarantee of victory. He had argued that if Japan were forced into war, it must strike hard and fast. But he also understood America's industrial capacity. He knew that the United States possessed vast shipyards, enormous natural resources, and a population capable of sustaining a long war. Yamamoto reportedly warned that Japan could dominate for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that, he could promise nothing. Still, in December 1941, optimism drowned out caution. The attack on Pearl Harbor had appeared devastating. 4 American battleships were sunk, 4 more were damaged, hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed, nearly 2,400 Americans were dead. For many in Japan's leadership, the psychological shock alone seemed worth the gamble. But even during the attack, decisions were made that would shape the future in ways Japanese planners did not fully anticipate. The strike had been carried out in 2 waves. After the second wave returned to the carriers, Japanese commanders debated launching a third. Additional attacks could have targeted oil storage facilities, submarine bases, and, most critically, the dry docks and repair yards that made Pearl Harbor a functioning naval base. Destroying those facilities might have rendered the harbor unusable for months, perhaps longer. But hesitation prevailed. Several factors influenced the decision. Japanese commanders feared that American defenses were strengthening. Anti-aircraft fire had increased during the second wave. There was concern about locating the missing American aircraft carriers, which were not in port and whose position was unknown. A prolonged presence near Hawaii risked counterattack. In the end, the task force withdrew. At the time, the decision seemed prudent. The primary objective, crippling the battleships, had been achieved. Why risk unnecessary losses? What Japanese planners underestimated was how rapidly the United States could adapt and how vital those untouched facilities would become. The massive oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor contained millions of barrels of fuel. They were untouched. Without them, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been forced to operate from the West Coast, thousands of miles farther from the front lines. Instead, ships could refuel in Hawaii and return to action. The dry docks and machine shops were also intact. These facilities would soon become the center of one of the most extraordinary salvage operations in naval history. But in Tokyo, the early interpretation of events focused on visible destruction. Photographs of burning ships reinforced the belief that American sea power in the Pacific had been broken. Meanwhile, Japanese forces moved swiftly across Asia. Within days, they launched offensives against the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and other territories. The strategy was clear: seize oil fields, secure defensive perimeters, and consolidate gains before the United States could recover. Initially, the plan appeared to work. Japanese advances were rapid and dramatic. Allied positions fell one after another. For a brief period, Japan's confidence seemed justified. Yet even in the first days after the attack, cracks in the narrative began to show. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had not been destroyed. Though battleships had symbolized naval power for decades, the nature of warfare at sea was already shifting. Aircraft carriers, capable of projecting air power across vast distances, would soon prove decisive. The absence of those carriers at Pearl Harbor was not part of Japan's design. It was chance. And chance had preserved the most flexible and dangerous elements of the American fleet. Furthermore, the United States did not respond with hesitation or negotiation as some Japanese leaders had quietly hoped. Instead, the attack unified the nation almost instantly.
In December 8, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. War was declared with near unanimity. Rather than discouraging American involvement, Pearl Harbor ensured total commitment. Within weeks, American industry began mobilizing at a scale unprecedented in modern history. Shipyards expanded, production lines accelerated, civilian factories converted to military manufacturing. The United States possessed an industrial base that dwarfed Japan's. In 1941, the United States produced more steel, more oil, and more automobiles than most of the world combined. That capacity would soon translate into ships, aircraft, tanks, and munitions. Japanese leaders hoped the shock of Pearl Harbor would buy them time to fortify conquered territories and force the United States into a negotiated settlement. Instead, it triggered a war of production that Japan could not match. Inside Japan's naval command, some officers recognized the danger. Yamamoto himself understood that the attack had awakened a powerful adversary. Though tactically brilliant, Pearl Harbor had failed to destroy America's ability to wage war. Even at Pearl Harbor itself, American recovery began almost immediately. Fires were extinguished, survivors were rescued, damage was assessed, salvage operations were planned. The harbor had not been reduced to rubble. It was wounded but operational. Japanese planners had focused on sinking ships. They had not fully accounted for the possibility that many of those ships could be raised. Battleships like West Virginia and California rested in shallow water. Though heavily damaged, they were not lost in the depths of the ocean. American engineers would soon prove that even sunken giants could be brought back to life. In hindsight, the decision not to launch a third wave is often viewed as one of the most consequential choices of the Pacific War. Destroying fuel reserves and repair facilities might have delayed American counteroffensives by many months. Instead, Pearl Harbor remained a forward base, a spear pointed westward. The psychological impact of the attack was undeniable. It shocked the American public. It reshaped foreign policy overnight. But psychologically, it also hardened American resolve. Recruitment surged. War bonds were purchased in enormous numbers. A nation previously divided over involvement in global conflict now stood unified. Japan had sought to deliver a disabling blow. It had succeeded tactically. Strategically, the outcome was far less certain. As 1942 approached, Japanese forces expanded across the Pacific in a sweeping arc of conquest. Yet beneath the surface of apparent momentum, the clock Yamamoto had once described was already ticking. The question was no longer whether America would respond, but how quickly. Pearl Harbor was meant to secure Japan's empire. Instead, it marked the beginning of a race against American industry, innovation, and determination. The celebration in Tokyo was real. The confidence was genuine. But victory had been declared too soon. Because while smoke still rose from the harbor, American divers were already descending into dark waters. And the ships Japan believed destroyed were not finished. They were waiting.
When the smoke began to thin over Pearl Harbor in the days after December 7, 1941, what remained looked beyond saving. Battleships rested in the mud. Steel hulls were torn open. Oil coated the water in thick black layers. The air still carried the smell of smoke and fuel. To many observers, the Pacific Fleet appeared destroyed. But within hours of the attack, even before all the fires were extinguished, the United States Navy had already begun asking a different question. Not what had been lost, but what could be saved. The answer would become one of the most remarkable engineering efforts of the Second World War. Rear Admiral Chester W. Nimitz would soon assume command of the Pacific Fleet, but on the ground at Pearl Harbor, the immediate responsibility fell to salvage officers, naval engineers, divers, and shipyard workers. Among the key figures was Captain Homer N. Wallen, who would later document the recovery effort in detail. Wallen and his team faced an enormous challenge: raise, repair, and return to service ships that the world believed were finished. The first step was assessment. Divers descended into dark, oil-filled water with limited visibility. They navigated twisted metal and unstable wreckage. Many compartments were flooded. Some still contained the bodies of sailors who had not escaped. The work was dangerous, emotionally draining, and technically complex. The USS West Virginia had sunk upright after taking multiple torpedo hits. The USS California had settled into the mud. The USS Nevada, though damaged, remained partially afloat after beaching herself. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized, her hull exposed above the waterline. Each ship presented a different problem. The harbor itself worked in America's favor. Pearl Harbor was relatively shallow. Many of the battleships had not slipped into deep water, but had settled on the bottom where salvage was possible. That geographic detail, overlooked in Japan's calculations, would prove critical. The salvage teams began with what seemed impossible. For ships like West Virginia and California, the process started with sealing holes in the hull. Divers patched torpedo damage with steel plates. Temporary cofferdams were constructed around damaged sections to create dry working environments. Massive pumps were brought in to remove thousands of tons of water from flooded compartments. As water was pumped out, the ships slowly began to rise. It was painstaking work. Crews worked around the clock. Engineers had to stabilize vessels to prevent capsizing during refloating. Structural reinforcements were installed to compensate for weakened frames. Ammunition had to be carefully removed. Fires that had smoldered for days were extinguished deep within damaged decks. Meanwhile, dry docks at Pearl Harbor, left untouched during the attack, became the center of reconstruction. The USS Nevada was among the first to enter dry dock. Though battered, she could be repaired. Within months, she would sail under her own power to the West Coast for further modernization. The USS California required extensive effort. After temporary repairs and refloating, she too would be sent to Puget Sound for rebuilding. The USS West Virginia, perhaps the most dramatic case, was raised, repaired, and completely modernized with improved armor and anti-aircraft weaponry. Even ships considered total losses were not abandoned lightly. The USS Oklahoma posed a monumental challenge. Capsized and partially submerged, she required an intricate righting operation. Engineers attached massive cables to her hull. Winches and hydraulic systems were installed along Ford Island. Over the course of months, the ship was slowly rolled upright in a carefully controlled operation. Though Oklahoma would ultimately be deemed too damaged for full return to combat service, the engineering achievement of righting her remains one of the most ambitious salvage efforts in naval history. The work was not only mechanical, it was emotional. Divers frequently encountered the remains of sailors trapped inside sunken ships. Recovery teams conducted solemn ceremonies when bodies were removed. For many involved in the salvage mission, the mission became deeply personal. They were not merely raising steel, they were honoring shipmates. While salvage operations continued, American industry surged into action across the mainland. Shipyards in California, Washington, and beyond expanded production. New destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers were laid down at record speed. The United States was mobilizing on a scale Japan had not anticipated. Yet the recovery at Pearl Harbor carried symbolic weight beyond its strategic value. Each ship that rose from the harbor sent a message to the American public and to Japan. The fleet had been struck, but it had not been erased. It had been tested. And in rising from the ashes, it signaled that the war in the Pacific was far from decided. Japan had measured success in sunken hulls and burning decks. It had not measured the determination of the men who would raise them. And that determination was already reshaping the war.
By late 1942, the waters of Pearl Harbor no longer looked like the graveyard they had become on December 7, 1941. Cranes still stood over repair docks. Welding sparks still flashed against steel. But something had changed. The fleet was coming back. Ships that had once rested on the harbor floor were now steaming across the Pacific, and they were not merely restored, they were transformed. The attack on Pearl Harbor had exposed vulnerabilities in American naval design. Battleships had been built for surface duels against other battleships. Heavy armor and massive guns defined their strength. But December 7th proved that air power could devastate even the most powerful ships at anchor. When the damaged vessels were raised and sent for major reconstruction, particularly to shipyards along the West Coast, engineers did not simply repair them to their original condition, they rebuilt them for a new kind of war. The USS West Virginia was one of the most dramatic examples. After being struck by multiple torpedoes and sinking at her berth, she was painstakingly refloated and sent to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. There, she underwent an extensive modernization. Her superstructure was redesigned, radar systems were installed, anti-aircraft batteries were massively expanded. When West Virginia returned to service in 1944, she was a far more capable warship than she had been before Pearl Harbor. The USS California followed a similar path. Raised from the mud of the harbor, she too underwent major reconstruction. Improved torpedo defenses, better compartmentalization, new radar arrays, and upgraded fire control systems made her a more modern and resilient vessel. The USS Nevada, which had famously attempted to escape the harbor during the attack, was repaired more quickly. After temporary fixes at Pearl Harbor, she sailed under her own power to the mainland for full upgrades. By 1942, she was already back in action. These ships carried scars, but they also carried new strength. Meanwhile, the nature of naval warfare was rapidly evolving. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other directly. Aircraft launched from carriers struck targets over the horizon. A month later, at Midway, American carrier-based aircraft delivered a decisive blow to Japan's carrier fleet. The era of the battleship as the uncontested ruler of the sea was ending. Yet the rebuilt battleship still had a vital role to play. As the United States shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns across the Pacific, amphibious assaults became central to strategy. Island by island, American forces advanced toward Japan. Before Marines could land, enemy shore defenses had to be neutralized. This is where the rebuilt battleships proved invaluable. With their massive 14-inch and 16-inch guns, ships like West Virginia, California, and Nevada delivered devastating shore bombardments. They pounded fortified positions, airfields, and artillery batteries ahead of amphibious landings. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, one of the largest naval battles in history, West Virginia played a remarkable role. In the Sarago Strait action, she and other American battleships engaged Japanese forces in a classic surface battle. Using radar-guided fire control, West Virginia fired accurately in darkness, striking enemy ships before they could effectively respond. It was a powerful moment of reversal. Less than 3 years earlier, she was sinking in the mud at Pearl Harbor. Now she was helping to destroy elements of the Japanese fleet. California and Nevada also participated in major operations across the Pacific. They supported landings in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the Philippines. Their guns thundered during invasions that pushed Allied forces steadily closer to Japan's home islands. The symbolism was undeniable.
Ships Japan believed destroyed were now directly contributing to its strategic setbacks. Even beyond the Pacific, the rebuilt fleet had global impact. USS Nevada provided naval gunfire support during the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. A ship that had survived Pearl Harbor was now firing on German positions in Europe, a testament to the interconnected scale of the war. The transformation of these battleships reflected something broader about American wartime adaptation. The attack on Pearl Harbor had exposed weaknesses: insufficient air defenses, inadequate readiness, over-reliance on traditional doctrines. But instead of clinging to outdated assumptions, the U.S. Navy adjusted rapidly. Radar technology expanded dramatically. Anti-aircraft coordination improved. Damage control procedures were revised and intensified. Crews trained relentlessly for air attack scenarios. The rebuilt ships embodied those lessons. Internally, they featured improved compartmentalization to limit flooding. Externally, their decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Radar arrays allowed them to detect incoming threats at greater distances. They were no longer simply gun platforms designed for ship-to-ship duels. They were integrated components of a carrier-centered fleet. By 1944 and 1945, the United States Navy had become the most powerful naval force in history. New fast battleships of the Iowa class had joined the fleet. Dozens of aircraft carriers were in operation. Submarines were choking Japanese supply lines. And at the heart of that fleet were ships once written off as losses. There was a psychological dimension to their return as well. For sailors who had survived the attack, serving aboard rebuilt ships carried deep meaning. It was a reminder that the devastation of December 7th had not ended their story. The fleet had endured. The nation had endured. When West Virginia steamed into battle, she carried not just weapons, but memory. Japan's strategic planners had believed that eliminating the battleship force at Pearl Harbor would buy them years of uncontested expansion. Instead, many of those same hulls were now supporting operations that dismantled Japan's defensive perimeter. By 1945, as American forces approached Okinawa and prepared for potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, battleships delivered some of the most intense bombardments of the war. The Pacific conflict had become one of relentless pressure, industrial, naval, and aerial. The rebuilt ships of Pearl Harbor were part of that pressure. Their return demonstrated a fundamental miscalculation in Japan's original plan. The assumption had been that destruction equaled permanent removal from the battlefield. But in shallow waters, with intact repair facilities and immense industrial backing, destruction proved temporary. Steel could be welded, hulls could be patched, systems could be upgraded. What could not be undone was the awakening of American resolve. By the time the war drew toward its final months, the question was no longer whether the United States had recovered from Pearl Harbor. It was how completely it had surpassed its pre-war strength. The ships that had burned in December 1941 now sailed in overwhelming numbers alongside new vessels built at astonishing speed. The Pacific Fleet was no longer wounded, it was dominant. And in the thunder of their guns across distant shores, the rebuilt battleships carried a message, one forged in smoke and oil and rising steel. Pearl Harbor had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a return.
In the weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese leaders believed they had reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific. The American battleship force had been crippled. The United States had been caught off guard. Across Asia, Japanese forces advanced with astonishing speed. At first glance, the gamble appeared to be working. Within months, Japan seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and vast stretches of resource-rich territory. Oil fields in the Dutch East Indies fell under Japanese control. Defensive perimeters expanded across thousands of miles of ocean. Tokyo spoke confidently of a new order in East Asia. But beneath that momentum lay a critical miscalculation, one that would ultimately define the outcome of the war. Japan had measured success in ships sunk and airfields destroyed. It had calculated tactical damage with precision. What it underestimated was the scale of American industrial power and the psychological effect of the attack itself. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and declared war.
The vote was nearly unanimous. Isolationist debates that had divided the country before the attack vanished almost overnight. The nation unified with remarkable speed. Factories that once produced cars and refrigerators shifted to tanks and aircraft. Shipyards expanded around the clock. Women entered industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers. War bond drives mobilized civilian support. The attack that Japan hoped would intimidate the United States instead ignited it. The numbers soon told the story. By 1943, American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace unmatched in history. Carriers, destroyers, submarines, and merchant ships rolled out in staggering quantities. Liberty ships were constructed in weeks rather than months. The United States outproduced Japan many times over in aircraft, ships, and munitions. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had feared this scenario. He understood that Japan's window for decisive victory was limited. If the war dragged on, America's industrial base would tilt the balance irreversibly. Pearl Harbor had not destroyed that capacity. It had accelerated it. Strategically, Japan's plan required a short war. The hope was that early, overwhelming victories would force the United States to negotiate, to accept Japanese dominance in Asia rather than commit to a costly, prolonged conflict across the Pacific. Instead, the United States committed fully. By mid-1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the momentum began to shift. At Midway, American carrier-based aircraft inflicted devastating losses on Japan's carrier fleet. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The battle marked a turning point, halting Japan's expansion and placing it increasingly on the defensive. From that point forward, the war became one of attrition, a contest of endurance and production. American submarines choked Japanese shipping lanes. Carrier task forces struck deeper into the Pacific. Island-hopping campaigns bypassed heavily fortified positions and isolated them. Each step brought American forces closer to Japan's home islands. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to replace losses. Industrial output could not keep pace. Fuel shortages worsened. Pilot training standards declined as experienced aviators were lost and could not be replaced quickly enough.
The attack on Pearl Harbor had been tactically brilliant. It demonstrated coordination, surprise, and boldness. But strategically, it failed to account for long-term consequences. It transformed a cautious United States into a determined wartime nation. It unified public opinion behind total victory. It triggered a mobilization that dwarfed Japan's resources. And perhaps most critically, it left key infrastructure at Pearl Harbor intact, allowing the Pacific Fleet to recover far faster than expected. The miscalculation was not in the execution of the attack itself. It was in the assumption about how America would respond. Japanese planners believed shock might lead to hesitation. Instead, it led to resolve. By 1944 and 1945, the imbalance was overwhelming. American fleets operated with dozens of aircraft carriers. Amphibious invasions struck island after island. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted Japan's industrial centers. The rebuilt battleships that had once burned at Pearl Harbor supported landings across the Pacific. New ships, fresh from American shipyards, joined them in numbers Japan could not match. The war that Japan had hoped to control became a war it could not sustain. When American forces captured Saipan in 1944, they gained bases within bombing range of Japan's home islands. When the Philippines were retaken, Japan's defensive perimeter fractured. By 1945, the conflict had reached Japan's doorstep. The final months of the war were devastating. Cities were destroyed by conventional bombing. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced a new and terrible chapter in human history.
On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The war that had begun for the United States at Pearl Harbor ended aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Looking back, historians often ask whether the attack on Pearl Harbor was Japan's greatest strategic mistake. It achieved surprise, it achieved destruction, but it failed to eliminate America's ability to fight and failed to break its will. In attempting to neutralize the United States, Japan ensured its full engagement. Pearl Harbor stands today not only as a site of tragedy, but as a turning point. The wreck of the USS Arizona still rests beneath the water, a memorial to the lives lost. The harbor remains active, a reminder that from devastation came determination. Japan believed it had struck a decisive blow. Instead, it awakened a superpower. The attack reshaped global alliances, accelerated technological innovation, and altered the course of the 20th century. It demonstrated how a single morning can transform geopolitics and how misjudging an opponent's resilience can change the fate of nations. The smoke that rose over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, seemed to signal victory for one side and disaster for the other. In the end, it marked the beginning of a long war that Japan could not win. History often turns not only on bold actions, but on flawed assumptions. Pearl Harbor was both, and its legacy endures as a warning, as a memorial, and as proof that destruction does not always determine destiny.